I just realized that my cup has a dove on it. Actually incredibly fitting for this video. Hi, my name is Kat. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Kat the Romantic. Today I'm going to be doing a book review of Serpent and Dove by author Shelby Mahurin. I don't actually have a physical copy of this book because I downloaded it digitally from my library, and I'm kind of glad that I didn't because it's one of these books that would just kind of sit on my bookshelf and I would never pick up again. Serpent and Dove made a really big splash in YA Lit around 2019 when it was released. And I was, scrolling through what was available in my library and looking for what I wanted to read, and I noticed that this book was available. I remember around 2019, this book generated a lot of buzz about it. So I was really curious what a lot of people were saying about it, and I decided to give it a try, especially since I've enjoyed quite a bit of YA Lit in the past. So I downloaded it onto my device and got reading. Now, as you can probably tell from the title of this video, I have some controversial opinions about this book, mainly that I honestly didn't really enjoy it that much, which I'm going to explain in a bit. But I'm definitely going to start off explaining a little bit about the book for anyone who might not be aware, and also list some of the things that I enjoy about the book. This review will be spoiler-free, so if you still want to read the book, you can go ahead. Serpent and Dove is the debut novel by Shelby Mahurin, and it follows Louise, who is a witch in a fantasy version of historical France. Through a series of coincidences and kind of some political maneuvering, she ends up in an arranged marriage with a witch hunter named Reid, who is unaware that she's a witch. In this world, there are multiple types of witches who use a pretty complicated system of magic. The witch hunters and, the society of this fantasy nation actively persecute witches and seek them out and try and kill them. There's, this sort of witch queen, and she's kind of campaigning against the government and the witch hunters to basically try and eliminate them first. So it's kind of this full-on war between witches and witch hunters. The book basically follows a kind of a dual perspective of both Louise and Reid as they kind of navigate their forced arranged marriage, and it's sort of an enemies to lovers story. So the idea is that they fall in love, and then by the end of the book, they kind of end up in a very different place than when they started off. As for the level of romance that was in this book was, very tame in terms of my personal romance meter, especially because I read a lot of adult romance. There is some kissing, there is a sex scene between the two main characters, just so you're aware, but it's not, Sarah J. Maas levels of sexual content. So that's what you can kind of expect in terms of romance in this book. I'll start off with the parts of this book that I liked. This book is a debut novel on the part of Shelby Mahurin, and it's a really good debut. I think a lot of the elements of the world and the world building was really creative. One thing I really enjoyed was how she described the magic system, the idea of kind of seeing these, patterns in the universe and, connecting dots was a really fascinating magic system to me. And there's also kind of like blood witches, and I thought that was super duper cool. I really enjoyed some of the twists in this book, and I thought that a lot of the baseline world building was pretty good. And I thought the concept was a really great idea. The whole kind of witch versus witch hunter and enemies to lovers thing has been done before, but I thought it was a fun concept, and I thought a lot of the kind of baseline parts were executed really well. My problems with this book mostly boil down to the characters and the fact that I never really got attached to many of them. The main character, Louise, is like pretty fierce and independent, but my main problem with her was that, I honestly found her pretty obnoxious. There's nothing wrong with, your main female character being this, very gutsy, loud, or even kind of obnoxious person, but I could never really get attached to Louise. I felt like she made decisions that were really not smart in a lot of situations. Like, the way she acts when she's forcibly getting hitched is just kind of crazy, and she really does not do a whole lot to make other people think that she's not kind of crazy. Everyone in this book immediately pins her as crazy, and she really never seems to have any desire to disabuse them of that notion. And there were so many times where I felt like she wasn't really leveraging, you know, any sort of strategy. She was just kind of stubbornly being kind of off the wall in body and kind of crazy, despite the fact that, like, she could have done some really smart kind of political maneuvering instead. So she kind of really got on my nerves. There was this recurring joke about this, like, drinking song that she would sing obnoxiously, and it never really hit for me. And, you know, this had multiple callbacks, so it just never really gelled for me. Some of the side characters were, like, relatively interesting, like her best friend, who, I'm sorry, like, I've already forgotten her name, were, you know, relatively interesting side characters, but I also never really felt like I got to know them super well. And one of the major weak points for me was also Reid, who's the other co-lead of the book, so that was kind of a problem. His personality seemed to just kind of be, like, uptight and, you know, kind of, mainly his personality was that he's a prude. The book was, you know, selling this thing about him being, you know, kind of this really well-regarded member and kind of this upper-level individual, but he kind of struck me as feeling, like, pretty naive for the position he had within the witch hunting organization, and so I never really, like, bought that aspect. And a lot of the interpersonal conflicts he had with his friends or whatever didn't really feel super dynamic or well-developed, in my opinion. So I just never really got attached to the characters. And then there were some side characters that had more prominent roles later on, like big revelations, and I didn't really get a huge sense of those characters either. So I feel like a lot more time could have been spent on the character work. We also need to talk about the enemies to lovers romance in this, which, in my opinion, was not carried off particularly well. And given that the whole point of this novel is this enemies to lovers romance between these two characters, that was a really important thing to nail, and I don't really think it worked super well. There was, like, a few scenes where Louise and Reid were together and you could kind of feel a bond developing, but I could count those scenes on one hand. And for me, the most important part of an enemies to lovers romance is that you have multiple events, like, scattered throughout the book that kind of slowly chip away at the resentment that these two characters have for one another. And I felt with this book, these two characters, A, did not spend nearly enough time together, and B, a lot of the time they spent together was spent very much in the kind of resentment stage, and there wasn't enough of a gradual softening towards one another, in my opinion. And as a result, as a flow-on of it not being kind of developed gradually enough, I found the whole kind of climax where these two characters do some pretty drastic things for one another rather unconvincing. The kind of flow-on effect of the whole major relationship not really working for me was what really hurt me when it came to my enjoyment of this book. If the central romance had been, you know, developed a little bit better, I think that I would have enjoyed it a lot more, and I probably would have been a lot more attached to the characters. I think that my opinion on the enemies to lovers romance in this book is also really shaped by a lot of the other similar romances I've read. For example, there's similar character concepts in things like Six of Crows, Nina and Matthias, who embody kind of the witch hunter and witch enemies to lovers romance. And in that case, I think it was done better because it was more gradual and there was more history there, and it was just developed a bit more strategically and a little bit more gradually over time. And also, I have read a lot of adult romances that hinge on some sort of enemies to lovers. After you've read, like, a really slow burn, really character-centered, and really intense enemies to lovers romance, like the kind that Mariana Zapata writes on a regular day, something like the enemies to lovers romance in this book doesn't really hold a candle. Maybe it's because I've spent, you know, quite a bit of time reading stuff other than YA. This all kind of seems fairly well trodden to me, so it really needs to mix it up for it to be good for me. But overall, I just wasn't super impressed by it. I thought some of the plotting in this book was good, and there were some good twists in it, but I also felt like they could have been executed a lot better. There were some things I kind of called, like there was a revelation about Louise's mom, which, you know, some part of it was really well carried off. I thought some of the flashbacks and explanations from Louise's perspective were really interesting, but I also, I also kind of saw it coming. I don't know if it's just because I've watched and read a lot of stuff that plays on similar tropes, but it just did not surprise me and delight me the same way. There was also some revelations near the end about Reid and where he came from that I felt kind of came out of the blue. I felt like there wasn't quite enough breadcrumbs left for that for it to feel satisfying or logical. And I also felt like the end of the book kind of threw in a bunch of revelations all at once that I felt like it kind of blew too many major plot points. I felt like because this book is presumably going to be a series, the author could have maybe reserved some of those surprises for later entries, but I just wasn't a huge fan of some of the seemingly last-minute revelations that happened in this book because I couldn't really see much of the footwork that the author put in to get there. I think that there's a lot of promise in this book and a lot of great potential, but it really didn't work for me. Sadly, if I had to give this book a rating, I would probably rate it either 2 out of 5 stars or 2.5 out of 5 stars. Mainly because I've seen a lot of the concepts executed better, and it just overall did not super impress me. I don't think I'm going to read any sequels to this series just because this book could not survive for me just on an interesting setting and concept alone. I needed to have some sort of attachment to either the main characters or some of the side characters in order to keep continuing to read a series. And in the case of this book, I just was not attached enough. That being said, after that kind of honestly cruel lambasting of this book, I would encourage you to maybe read it for yourself and see what you think. I'm not going to be one of those people that says that because I personally did not enjoy this book, you shouldn't read it. If you haven't read a whole lot of enemies to lovers books and this is your entry, I think that you might actually enjoy this. I think that maybe I'm just a really jaded romance reader at this point because I've read so many different romance stories and I've seen so many different twists on this sort of romance setup. And I've also read a lot of fantasy, so I've seen a lot of different fantasy worlds and setups as well. So it takes a lot to get me to say that something is really exceptional and amazing. So maybe I'm just too much of a jaded book reviewer at this point. But those are my thoughts on Serpent and Dove. What did you think about it? Do you disagree? Do you have any defenses for why this book is better than I thought it was? Do you think that this book is overrated? Do you agree with my criticisms? Or did you really, really enjoy it? I want to hear your thoughts below. Have a nice discussion/argument in the comments if you disagree. I'm really curious to see what other people say because personally this book was not exactly my cup of tea. Meanwhile, I'm gonna go, read some more romance books and see what is my cup of tea. But yeah.